Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's event. My name's Sian Bradley. I'm a Senior Research Fellow here at Chatham House, and I'm delighted to be back with the New Producers Group today for this really important discussion on the IEA Net Zero by 2050 report. Now, since the report's publication, there has unsurprisingly been lots of discussion about what this means for established oil and gas producers. But of course, our discussion today is a little bit different because the New Producers Group, as the name suggests, brings together emerging and prospective producers. And we have representatives from a really, really diverse group of countries on the line today, from Guyana, Lebanon, Suriname, Guyana, Uganda, and many other members of the New Producers Group. And given their stage of development and their stage of oil and gas production, these countries have very different choices available to them, including the choice not to lock in fossil fuel intensive energy and industrial infrastructures at home and to take advantage of some of the more affordable, more accessible, more resilient technologies that are now available. And of course, the choice not to develop new oil and gas resources at all, where on the best available information, it no longer makes sense to. So in today's session, we're going to be exploring the IEA's net zero pathway and the risks that it presents to these emerging oil and gas producers, and also, of course, the huge opportunities that it can offer in terms of sustainable economic development, access to energy, and inclusive, resilient jobs. Now, we have two fantastic speakers to take us through all of this, Christophe McGlade and Jasmine Samantar from the IEA. Christophe is a senior energy analyst, Jasmine is Africa energy analyst, and both Christophe and Jasmine are absolutely at the heart of the IEA's work on net zero, so they're excellent guides for today's discussion. And we also have Theo Achiampong, who is joining us today, who's a petroleum economist and oil and gas and energy sector advisor and an associate lecturer at the universities of Aberdeen and Dundee, among many other affiliations. And he'll be our respondent, helping kick off discussions. So Theo, thank you for joining us. And of course, we have all of you here with us. So we are running this as a Zoom meeting rather than a webinar. So please do switch on your cameras and give us a wave. It's great to see so many of you, so many familiar faces on the line. And we'll try and make this as conversational and as practical and as applied as we can, particularly for our country participants. Now, before we get into the discussion, just a couple of housekeeping points. So first of all, in the discussion, please do come in with your comments, your suggestions, your questions by typing your name in the chat box or using the raise hand function. And then when I call you in, you can unmute and speak to our panelists and other participants directly. And of course, if you have a burning question or a comment during the initial presentation, please do type it in the chat box and we can loop back to it in conversation. And please also finally note that today's meeting is on the record. It's being recorded and it will be made available on the New Producers Group website afterwards. So with all of that said, Christophe, Jasmine, I will hand over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sian. I'll just share my screen. So good morning, good afternoon and good evening to you all. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. It's a real pleasure to speak with you on the IEA's first ever global roadmap for the energy sector to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And it's great that Jasmine is able to join me here. We are going to give a short presentation. I'll do the first half and Jasmine will do the second half. But before getting into some of the results of the scenario itself, by way of context, as many of you or all of you will know, many governments and companies have given themselves the target to reach net zero emissions by the year 2050. And it was in this context that we were requested by the UK COP presidency to lay out a roadmap for the energy sector to reach net zero emissions, CO2 emissions by the year 2050. But I want to highlight one thing at the very start here, that this is our pathway that we have newly developed, but we should recognize that it is just one possible pathway towards net zero emissions by 2050. There are many other possible pathways towards achieving that objective. But jumping straight into what this would mean, to give some examples of what would need to happen to be on course to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Roughly speaking, we need to cut CO2 emissions from today by around about 40% by the year 2030. Unfortunately, many of the technologies that are needed to do this are already available and cost effective today. For example, annual capacity additions of solar PV and wind have quadrupled over the past decade, and those capacity additions would need to quadruple again over the period to 2030. Put out another way, in 2020, we installed around about 250 gigawatts of wind and solar. And in 2030, we need to install well over 1,000 gigawatts. And this would mean that in the year 2030, it would be like installing the world's largest solar park that exists today every single day within the year 2030. And as a result of doing this, wind and solar would provide around about 40% of global electricity generation in 2030, up from less than 10% today. Electric car sales also grow rapidly in our net zero pathway. In 2020, less than 5% of cars that were sold around the world were electric. And by 2030, this needs to reach around about 60% globally. And soon after 2030, by around about 2035, in our pathway, there are no new sales of internal combustion engine cars anywhere around the world. Boosting energy efficiency is also a key part of the scenario. There are many efficiency measures and opportunities in industry, in buildings, in appliances, and transport, and these can often be put into effect quickly and scaled up very quickly. And that's what we see happening in our pathway. And as a result of this, the energy intensity of the global economy falls by around about 4% every year to 2030. This is roughly speaking a tripling of the rate of efficiency improvements that we've seen historically. Our pathway towards net zero emissions is achieved even while there is very rapid economic growth around the world. The global economy expands by around about 150% to 2050, and the world's population increases by around about 2 billion people. And at the same time, there's a huge surge in clean energy investments. Total investment in these clean energy technologies exceeds $4 trillion by the year 2030. And to give one example here, investment just in renewables in the electricity sector would be more than the highest ever level spent on fossil fuel. So $1.3 trillion spent on renewables in the power sector in 2030. The highest level ever spent on fossil fuels was $1.2 trillion in 2014. But while we see this big surge in clean energy investment, there is a large drop in fossil fuel investment in this scenario. So global investment in fossil fuel supply falls steadily. It was around about $600 billion globally over the past 5 years. And this drops to around about $300 billion in 2030, and then to less than $100 billion in 2050. And one of the big milestones that we see in our pathway is that beyond projects that are already committed or will be approved for development by the end of 2021, there is no need for new oil and gas fields. In addition, there's no new coal mines or mine extensions that are required, and also not needed are many of the LNG liquefaction facilities that are currently under construction or at the planning stage. Fossil fuel prices are also significantly lower in our pathway. For example, the oil price drops to around about $35 per barrel in 2030, and then to around about $25 per barrel in 2050. And one of the underlying principles that we have with the net zero scenario is that it should be an orderly transition. And so we want to avoid excessive volatility in oil markets and in oil prices. But what happens here really depends to a large extent on the strategies that will be adopted by resource-rich governments and their national oil companies around the world. And in our net zero pathway, we assume that despite a number of these countries having some of the lowest cost resources at their disposal, they restrict investment in new fields. And this limits the need for shutting in and closing higher cost oil and gas production. And what this means is that the oil price in the scenario is, broadly speaking, sufficient to cover the cost of the operating costs of a number of fields, but it would also be high enough to develop new fields in a number of low-cost producers. But as I said, we assume that the major resource holders don't proceed with new investment, because doing so would create significant additional downward pressure on oil and gas prices, which in the long term may lead to volatility and may lead to a worse situation overall. And I'm sure we'll come back to this point in our discussion subsequently. But the overall surge that we see in clean energy investment actually leads to a boost in global economic growth. Based on our joint analysis that we carried out with the International Monetary Fund, we estimate that the surge that we see in clean energy spending could add around about 0.4 percentage points per year to annual GDP growth over the period to 2030. And this is like adding an economy the size of Japan's to the world economy in 2030. However, we should recognize that there will be large differences in impacts between regions, with the declines in fossil fuel income impacting many countries, and as a result, these countries needing to accelerate the process of reforming inefficient fossil fuel subsidies and also speeding up moves towards using hydrocarbon resources in ways that is consistent with a net zero world, for example, by producing low emissions fuels. And before handing it over to Jasmine, the changes that we see in spending and investment radically shift the energy workforce. Globally, in 2019, we estimated there's around about 40 million people working in energy supply. And the surge that we see in clean energy investment increases the number of jobs by around about 14 million new jobs in electricity and low carbon fuel sectors. But there are some job losses, around about 5 million job losses globally in fossil fuels, predominantly in coal, but also because we don't require new oil and gas fields, there's no need for new fossil fuel exploration. And therefore, there are some job losses there. And many of these jobs are located close to fossil fuel resources, and many are well paid. And so there could be structural issues for communities that could persist over a long period of time. And so we really want to highlight that it's vital that we minimize hardships associated with these disruptions. For example, by retraining workers, and where possible, locating clean energy facilities in heavily affected areas. The vast majority of jobs that we see that are created are in medium and highly skilled positions. And as I say, this will require rapid expansion in the availability of training through secondary education, through vocational programs, and through shifting workers from existing areas to ensure that the availability of skills doesn't act as a logjam towards the move towards clean energy technologies. And I'll finish there and hand it over to Jasmine.
Thank you very much, Christophe. Now turning to innovation, as mentioned earlier, we basically have all the technologies available in the market today to achieve the emissions reductions needed to reach net zero emissions by 2050. But a full transition to net zero emissions will require much more than that. It will require tackling emissions in sectors like long distance transport, as well as heavy industries. And while we know the kinds of technologies that can help achieve their full decarbonization, we don't have them available yet in the market. Many today are still in the demonstration or even prototyping stages. There are many technology options that can help decarbonize these sectors, covering options such as electrification, carbon capture, hydrogen, and bioenergy. And in 2050, almost 50% of CO2 emissions reductions in the ability come from technologies that are currently not available in the market. Now, the pace of innovation for clean energy technologies needed to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 must be much more rapid than what the fastest energy technology developments achieved in the most recent past. For governments, there are two aspects of innovation that are fundamentally important and that we'd like to stress. Firstly, an increased impetus to innovation is needed by reprioritizing spending. $90 billion needs to be mobilized in order to complete a portfolio of demonstration projects before 2030. And this is compared to the $25 billion that's currently budgeted and allocated by governments. Secondly, international cooperation must be brought to new heights by accelerating innovation, developing international standards, as well as coordinating to scale up clean technologies. Our analysis shows that without such international cooperation, it'll take several decades longer to reach net zero emissions. So innovation is not in conflict with the rollout of technologies. They're two sides of the same coin. The 2020s needs to be a decade of rolling out technologies in the market today, as well as innovation to get out all of these technologies and put them into market. Now turning to energy security. It's clear that a pathway to net zero that ignores energy security is going to be much longer as well as challenging. The drop in oil and gas demand and the increased diversity of the energy sources used will reduce some traditional risks, but they don't disappear. Because no new oil and natural gas fields are needed, supplies become increasingly concentrated in a small number of low-cost producers. For oil, the result is that the overall share of OPEC in global oil supply grows from around 34% in 2020 to 52% in 2050. This is a level that's higher than at any point in the history of oil markets. Annual per capita income from oil and natural gas producers falls by about 75% in the 2030s, and this could affect social stability as well as the secure supply from these countries. But there are other opportunities, as the expertise of the oil and gas industry fits well with the technologies like hydrogen, CCUS, and offshore wind that are needed to tackle emissions in sectors where reductions will be the most challenging. The energy transition requires substantial quantities of critical minerals, and the scale-up of wind, solar PV, as well as battery all require large quantities of minerals like copper, cobalt, manganese, and various other rare earth metals. The total demand for these minerals grows almost 7-fold in our pathway. The production and processing for many of these minerals is also much more geographically concentrated than is the case for oil and natural gas. This could create energy security concerns, and if supply can't keep up with demand, there could be price volatility as well as additional costs for transitions. Finally, there are new potential vulnerabilities associated with the need to maintain reliable, flexible, and secure electricity systems. Electricity demands grow by 2.5 times, and at the same time, the share of solar PV and wind rises from 9% in 2020 to almost 70% in 2050. The result is that the need for electricity system flexibility quadruples by 2050. There's a growing role for demand response, battery storage systems, and dispatchable low emission sources. Expanding in smarter and more digital electricity grids also enables enhanced power system flexibility. Now turning to milestones. Every country has its own circumstances and will make its own plans for a transition to net zero, but I'd like to finish by highlighting some of the key global milestones that we see on the road to net zero. First, I mentioned one of the key results of the pathway is that no new oil and gas fields are required. But this does not mean that the skills of fossil fuel companies needs to go to waste. The oil and gas industry could play a key role in helping develop at scale a number of clean energy technologies, such as carbon capture, biofuels, and offshore wind. Scaling up these technologies and bringing down their costs will rely on large-scale engineering and project management capabilities, quantities that are a good match for those of large oil and gas companies. For supporting this increased level of critical minerals, clearly mining expertise is going to be very valuable. Another example of where they could play a role is for hydrogen, which is set to become an increasingly part of our energy mix. Today, there are around 250 megawatts of electrolyzers installed globally. In our pathway, this reaches 850 gigawatts by 2030. We also need to scale up CCUS from around 40 MT today to 1600 MT by 2030. Another big milestone for the electricity sector is that it becomes the first sector to achieve net zero emissions at a global level by 2040. And this occurs as early as 2035 in aggregate in advanced economies. Finally, to conclude, we of course acknowledge that our scenario is just a pathway to net zero emissions. It certainly is not the only pathway. Our aim is to inform as well as stimulate the debate on how we can achieve our collective climate goals. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing your reactions as well as your questions today. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. So that's a fascinating presentation and a huge amount of information to take in. And I think, as you said, Christophe, at the outset, the key message here really that there is a narrow but feasible pathway to net zero that can come with huge socioeconomic benefits, but it really does require a whole systems transformation, including, of course, a huge decline in oil and gas supply and demand. And you mentioned, of course, the well known and heavily repeated requirement for no new oil and gas reserves to come online. The implications for fossil fuel prices hovering around $35 2035, did you say, and 25 for 2050. You didn't touch on the absolute decline, but we're basically talking about a 75% decline in oil demand by 2050, right? And 55% in gas. So we are thinking ultimately in terms of producers effectively competing for that remaining 25% of oil, 45% of gas, right? And then, of course, this massive increase in clean energy investment. So 4 trillion by 2030, more than ever spent on fossil fuels. And this staggering statistic on the need to deliver the equivalent of the world's largest solar facility every day. So obviously, decisive action required by all governments to put in place policies to support that kind of a transition and to really understand the risks associated with oil and gas expansion along a net zero pathway. And of course, this need for accelerated innovation, demonstration and deployment. And it would be great to pick up on some of the points that Jasmine raised in conversation, and particularly how emerging producers can participate and benefit in this. Many more questions around the assumptions that you make around existing large reserve holders, but we can pick up on that in the discussion. Before I move on, were there any immediate clarifications on the presentation that we've just heard from Christophe McGlade? Please hold comments and questions for the discussion, but if there are any immediate and specific clarifications, please shout. No, okay, nothing coming on. So we'll move on to Theo quickly. Theo, so you're going to kindly share some initial reflections to help kick off our discussion. Theo, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Fantastic presentations from both persons, and it really sets the tone, I think, for a number of the issues that most of us would be concerned about, coming from countries that have these resources, and I mean oil and gas resources, and want to exploit it. But if I pick the main highlight of the message that have just been shared, one, which is that there's no place for any new oil and gas exploration or supply, or indeed coal. And two other smaller points around the fact that not every worker in the fossil fuel industry can easily kind of ease into that clean energy transition job, which raises questions about industrial strategy going forward for a lot of countries. But I also think the third or other big point really being around the idea of fair and inclusive or just transitions. And it goes back to the big question really is the transition really going to be fair and inclusive? Because the evidence, at least so far, shows that you are going to have some asymmetric effects, especially if you have a rapid, transition where a lot of the, new producer countries are extremely dependent on these resources for their economy. So, in Africa, which I know very well, in Angola, for example, oil and gas is 15% of the country's GDP, 85% of exports. Congo, 68% of revenues, 86% of exports. Equatorial Guinea, 81%, 97% of export, and so on and so forth. And other countries are looking to kind of join this bandwagon. So it comes back, I think, to some fundamental questions, which in the context of the transition, a lot of countries need to reflect and think about. Yes, it is not the case that there wouldn't be oil in the equation. The pathway to the transition and where oil prices or demand will be in the future, nobody really knows. But the reality is that some policy trade-offs need to be made. So in kind of trying to reflect on this and wrapping up and opening the space for the conversation or the discussion going forward, I would like to kind of posit or advocate for maybe the 5 strategic options that new producer countries need to think about. Number one, what would be the new sort of exploration strategy that would be required to bring to market these low cost or advantage barrels? Number two, what sort of regulatory and investment environment is actually needed to be created in order to benefit from both the upside, but also even you could argue the downside of this transition. And it goes back to the third question I have been thinking about around asset stewardship and infrastructure, that if you're going to have a lot of potential stranded assets because of the refocus of capital investment by the IECs and the financiers and longer term concerns about oil demand, then how do we ensure that, for example, those barrels that are located close to infrastructure can actually be tied in and extracted? And it goes back to kind of what happened in the North Sea in the early 2000s, where a lot of the large majors left, but we saw some new entrants entering or coming into the market, and mostly private equity backed, some made independent, but they were still able to sweat these assets and make a return on them, even with oil prices around $40 a barrel. So, I mean, what then strategy then would countries kind of seek to adopt in relation to that? And my kind of fourth, I think, strategic option or response is around capacity development and the wider supply chain strategy. And it calls for questions around even the role of the national oil companies in a lot of the new producing countries in the equation. But also coming back to the more fundamental point here is that if we look at the basic economics or the supply cost curve, then if the energy transition is a given and we assume that oil prices ultimately will become depressed in the long term, then those countries or those producers that sit at the lower end of that cost curve will be the ones that will get their resources extracted. And it then pushes one back to actually think about the reforms that I think would be needed by producing countries to ensure that at least, one, their industries can be competitive, but beyond that, you know, the bigger push about diversification and taking advantage of the upside of the transition to build, you know, industrial clusters and linkages that ensures that these economies ultimately become competitive and we move away from the proverbial, you know, paradox of plenty or resource care. So these are sort of my kind of broad thoughts, listening to the fantastic points that have been made earlier, and I hope it sort of stimulates some of the conversation going forward around what countries must do on exploration, stranded assets, the regulatory environment that we need around asset stewardship and infrastructure, and on wider capacity development and the supply chain. Thank you.
Thank you, Theo. Some really, really interesting and thoughtful comments to get us started there, really highlighting the need for integrated planning and policy that really engages with energy and industrial development. And also more broadly, I would say with economic governance and climate policy. And that's something that we've done a huge amount of work on here at Chatham House and with the New Producers Group. And of course, this need for a just transition. And of course, there's the issue of a just transition between countries. And of course, the net zero scenario distinguishes between developed and developing countries in terms of the speed of transition. And then there's the issue of a just transition within countries. So how to manage the negative distributional impacts and also how to take advantage and enhance equality of access to opportunities created by the clean economy transition. And of course, your 4 strategic points, which hopefully our participants can come back and engage with. On this note, I mean, we'll open up the floor here for discussion. I can see a couple of questions coming in. Just to reiterate, we're running this as a Zoom meeting, so please feel free to type your name in the chat box, and you can come in and present your question to the panelists, to us, to other participants yourself, or equally feel free to jot your questions in the comment box. We have a few, as Theo, you've just mentioned the issue of a just transition very prominently in your comments, and we also have some questions here from Miguel Moyano. Miguel, please unmute yourself and come in if you would like to present these questions yourself, or else I can run through them. Miguel, please, the floor is yours.
Hello everyone, excellent presentations. My organization is based in Latin America, and as many new producing countries like Guyana and Suriname, plus Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, they rely, actually 70% of the energy in Latin America depends from oil and gas. So the pathway that is being presented, we don't believe is going by IEA, we don't think is going to be very much applicable to Latin America, but the most important thing is that we have been mostly speaking about environmental considerations, energy investments, reliability and affordability, but we are forgetting the ultimate beneficiary of our work, which is people. So we must address people's needs, the energy, the work, and this was only addressed by the IEA on January of this year, when they decided to create the Global Commission on People-Centered Clean Energy Transitions. So my question was that shouldn't we always be talking about the just transitions? Shouldn't IEA be talking about that? And the second question is very much related to what Sian was talking, and that is, we always hear about the new jobs being created, but those are aggregated numbers globally. And where, geographically speaking, where are the new jobs created by the new renewable energy, and where are they being lost during the energy transitions roadmap that the IEA developed? I would like to see, where do you get those numbers from? Thank you.
Christophe, Jasmine, if we hand over to you, yeah, and your wider thoughts on the background work that the IEA has done in terms of informing the net zero scenario and its links to the IEA People-Centered Transitions Commission would be great.
Certainly, thank you, Sian, and thank you, Miguel, for the question. I'll start briefly, just give a little background, and then I'll hand it over to Jasmine for the details. It's great that you've mentioned the Global Commission that was set up in January, but I wouldn't see that as just the very beginning of the IEA looking at just transitions. We've been looking at scenarios that aim to achieve more than just decarbonization for many years. So, for example, a number of years ago, we developed what we call the Sustainable Development Scenario, which aimed not only to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, but also to achieve universal electricity access and universal access to clean cooking. But Jasmine can give the details on that. Maybe just before I do that, though, while I have the floor, I'll pick up on the second question on jobs, because this is really important, and this is something that we have been placing an increasing amount of our analysis on. So you may have been aware that around about this time last year, we did a report called Sustainable Recoveries, which was looking at how the world can recover from the impacts of the pandemic while stimulating economic growth, creating jobs, and also getting us in line with our long-term climate objectives. And we've since then been doing quite a bit of work on looking at jobs in the energy sector and jobs that would be created or potentially lost under our different scenarios. So I mentioned, for example, in terms of job losses, because of this big reduction that we see in coal demand, even over the next 10 years, a lot of the job losses are going to be related to coal mining. There's also some related to coal-fired power plants, but where those jobs are located are clearly going to be close to the largest mining countries today. China is has a huge coal mining sector, for example. And then for oil and gas, I mentioned that exploration is one of the areas that isn't required in the net zero pathway. So if you assume that we will have this huge surge in clean energy investment, all of these demand side policies which will reduce fossil fuel demand, then you don't require any new fossil fuel exploration, and therefore the people that are currently employed in fossil fuel exploration would need to move to other areas. But saying that, there is still oil and gas being consumed in the world. There is, even in 2050, 24 million barrels per day of oil, 1,700 BCM of natural gas. So fossil fuels don't disappear overnight. So there are still some investments that are required. And just to put one number on this, in 2020, there was around about $300 billion spent in fossil fuel and oil and gas supply, I should say. Now, 2020 was an abnormal year for many reasons, but roughly speaking, what we require over the next decade in the net zero pathway is about $300 billion per year. So actually, what we saw in 2020 is what's required for the next 10 years in that pathway. So there is still some investment, there is still some production going, and so it's not as if all of these jobs will be lost immediately. What we're trying to do as a scenario is to highlight where the risks are, and that there is risks of job losses, and that therefore governments should be taking that into account when they think about clean energy transitions. They have to make sure that they are just transitions as well. That it's not acceptable just to say, well, we'll just let this large numbers of people lose their jobs and not provide them any support, whether that's secondary education, whether it's locating clean energy facilities close to where they can be, whether it's reskilling so that it can shift existing skill sets towards clean energy technologies. All of these are a vital part of the net zero pathway to ensure that it is very much a people-centered transition. But I'll hand over to Jasmine now to speak a little bit more about the work that we've done on energy access.
Thanks, Christophe, and thanks, Miguel, for your question, especially the focus that you put on people, which is at the heart of every conversation. So currently today, around 800 million people worldwide lack access to electricity, and we know that the majority are in sub-Saharan Africa as well as developing Asia. But it's important to note that in our scenario, in the net zero emissions roadmap, we achieve universal access by 2030 through a variety of means, about 45% being from the grid, 30% from mini grids, and 25% from standalone solar home systems. And almost all of these off-grid solutions are 100% renewable combined with battery storage. So it's important to note that this is not in conflict with decarbonization, and that our roadmap in short will push forward electricity access for all by 2030. So I hope that touches on that part about people, but I'm actually very interested to continue the conversation offline, and I'll share my email in the comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Jasmine. And can I ask if anyone else has any specific questions related to just transition, to please flag them now, and we'll bring you in at this stage of the conversation. And I just want to pick up on one of the comments in the chat box here from Fred Amonia, asking, should we be urging a slower pace of transition for low-income countries? Doesn't this hold back low-income countries from frontier science? And this is something that we've often discussed. Is it a really lazy assumption that developing countries should go slow in transition? And isn't there an incredible opportunity here for emerging and prospective producers to actually develop in a very, very different way and not build out those domestic infrastructures and really shield their economies from domestic carbon risk, while using revenues and other financial benefits to drive the cleanest, most resilient economy that is possible? So yeah, it'd be good, Christophe, to come back to you on that. Yeah, Fred just flagging his question, and particularly in terms of energy access, and a lot of the discussion when we talk about just transition, I guess we're talking about two facets here. One is livelihoods and the impact on jobs, and of course many emerging producers are in a materially different position to the big coal economies, and actually have struggled to develop local content and local employment, and a lot of the labor in their industries is expat in any case. So it's a slightly different starting point for many low-income countries. And then of course this access to services and the cost of living. So there's a question here from Matuma Marangu about energy access versus minimum levels of energy access. And so yeah, it would be great to get your thoughts, Christophe, Jasmine, on what assumptions, what standards are assumed in the net zero scenario.
Thanks, Sean, and thanks again everyone for the questions. So picking up on Fred's point first, I think we should recognize here that this is a very, very radical scenario, and that everybody has to move incredibly quickly. Advanced economies have to get in aggregate to net zero by 2045, and emerging market and developing economies by 2050. So there is a difference there, but it's not a massive difference. If the world is to get to net zero, everybody needs to do things very, very quickly. And the reason that we have this slight difference in the years is because of the different starting points. This is a race to net zero, but everyone is running at a slightly different pace and starting at a different location. And because of the very rapid economic growth in developing economies, and because of the very rapid population increase that we have, therefore there is this big increase in demand for energy services. And it's as a result of that if you want to ensure that those energy services are met while we're still moving towards net zero emissions, that we have this difference in timing of when zero emissions is achieved. But one of the crucial things for this to happening, and in order to get those clean energy technologies in developing economies, is to do with financing. And just last week, we put out another report looking at financing clean energy transitions in emerging market and developing economies. And there are a number of highlights in there, which I won't go through now, but one of the key things is about needing around about $1 trillion of investment into those countries, compared to, on average, we've seen about $150 billion over the past 5 to 10 years. So we need this huge scaling up in financing. And this is one of the key things that needs to happen if we are to see emission reductions in emerging market and developing economies. It's very often the case that $1 spent reducing emissions in developing economies is better at reducing emissions than $1 spent in advanced economies for a whole host of reasons. But this isn't reflected always in the transition pathways that countries develop. They quite often develop pathways just for themselves. The UK looks, how can the UK become net zero? How can the United States reach net zero? And one of the things that we want to urge and to encourage, if the world needs to move towards net zero emissions, is that everyone needs to work together on this. And it doesn't matter if emissions come from the United States, or they come from Russia, or they come from China, or they come from Africa. A ton of CO2 is the same everywhere. And so what the world should be doing is looking at how can we best reduce emissions most quickly, and do it in the way that can often be done most cheaply. And so there is a need for everyone to work together. And so, as I'm saying, everyone needs to work very hard towards achieving that long-term goal. I wanted just to add one other thing on what Jasmine said on energy access, because electricity is clearly crucial. But the net zero scenario also has a move away from the traditional use of bioenergy for cooking. Today, there's around about 2.6 billion people who rely on traditional biomass, we call it, for cooking. This is a huge cause of indoor air pollution, and it's a huge cause of premature deaths. So we also, alongside the move towards achieving universal electricity access, we have a big shift away from the traditional use of bioenergy. And this provides an awful lot of additional benefits. It reduces indoor air pollution. It reduces premature deaths. It also frees up time for people. If you can use a more modern form of cooking, we often see that it's often the case that a very large amount of time is spent from people collecting wood and other energy sources for cooking. If they can use more modern energy sources, then that can free up that time and use it potentially more productively. So again, it is very important that we see all of these things as being potentially working in collaboration rather than being in conflict. Jasmine, I don't know if there's anything you want to add on the other questions, but other than that, I see there's still plenty of questions coming in, so I don't want to go on for too long.
Thanks, Christophe. You touched on everything. Sorry, Sean. I was going to say that we can just dive into the other questions. You touch on everything. Thanks.
Right. So Christophe, you've flagged the critical question of finance. What I'm going to suggest is that we loop back to that and first tackle the questions that are coming in the chat box on, there's a couple here on the carbon intensity of fuel production. So I think, let me just dig through this. There's a lot of questions here. In terms of the risks of stranded assets, how does IEA expect the concept of non-competitive stranded oil and gas assets to emerge? And there are questions here about carbon content, sulfur content, other fuel qualities. So maybe there's a broader question here, I think, about upstream emissions reductions and how to create the cleanest barrel of oil, the cleanest gas exports, and what factors you see shaping, you know, the most competitive and resilient producers, and who stays in the market as it tightens. And then one just from myself on the stranded assets question, and particularly the question of the assumptions that you make in terms of established producers restricting production to avoid shutting in and closing higher cost resources. Which, you know, can you say a bit more about which producers or which regions we're talking about making these restrictions, and what are the implications of this not happening in terms of the cost curve for production, for commercially viable production over time, and of course on the oil price?
Two very important points there. So firstly, on emissions intensities, this is something that we have been looking at in increasing detail in recent years. There is a very large spectrum between the best performing operators around the world and the worst performing operators. And there's a whole host of reasons for this. Some of this is to do with the geological characteristics of the oil and gas, but it's also related to how the operators are actually extracting that. For example, are there large levels of flaring? Are there large levels of methane emissions occurring? And one of the important aspects of the net zero pathway is that operators everywhere expend all efforts that they can do to ensure that the oil and gas that they have is as clean as it possibly can be. So what this means is ensuring that there are no methane leaks, avoiding as much as you can that is technically possible. It's electrifying upstream operations, it's electrifying LNG facilities, it's using carbon capture and storage where it's applicable, it's using renewables on site to power drilling equipment, for example. It's doing all of these things to make sure that this very wide spectrum we have today doesn't exist anymore, so that there's really, it's a bit more of a flat line, so the best performing barrels are not that different from the worst performing barrels. And if they do this, this is one of the reasons that we don't see a need for new oil and gas developments. That we have, many people have said to us since we released this report, would it be okay for a new ultra clean field to come online, which displaces a existing dirty field? Well, it would make sense if we didn't make this assumption that the dirty field makes a lot of efforts to reduce its overall emissions intensities. So part of this $300 billion that I mentioned is spent over the next decade is towards making sure that oil and gas is as clean as possible. If, however, I'm kind of coming to your second point, Shannon, if people do open up new fields, it doesn't mean that the net zero scenario can't be achieved, by no means. But what the net zero scenario and what the roadmap does is it highlights that there is a big risk for those new projects. And this is a risk that any new project developer needs to take into account. Will there be a market for this oil and gas that we produce? Theo was very rightly highlighted in his remarks about the importance of it being very low cost. I would also say, just as importantly, is it's low emissions to make sure that there is a market for that oil and gas. If they can do that, then maybe it is the case that that could be opened and another field will have to shut down. It's just to kind of give a bit of background as to how we did the modeling for this. This is a demand-led scenario. What this means is that governments put in place the measures to reduce CO2. This leads to this huge surge in clean energy investment, this huge surge in investment in energy efficiency. And all of that means that fossil fuel demand starts to fall. And whenever we were looking at the modeling of this, we saw, well, what that means from the supply side is that you don't require any new oil and gas fields. It's a kind of, I wouldn't say it's a coincidence as such, but the two things match up very closely. That demand is falling at the rate that supply would fall without any new fields. There's not, the logic of the scenario doesn't work the other way. It doesn't say that if you cut off all supply, that demand would fall at the same rate, and therefore you would reach the same objective. This is a demand-led scenario. If there are new fields that open up, that would mean that the highest cost producer will probably drop off, and it would likely mean that oil prices fall even more than we have. So I mentioned $35 per barrel in 2030. There are a number of new and emerging producers who could open up a new field for less than $35 per barrel. But if they do that, you would expect the oil price to come down even more. And what this suggests to us is that if they were to do this, let's say this would bring the oil price down to $10 per barrel. They would have to keep bringing it down to knock off. If people keep opening new fields, more expensive fields have to come offline, and the oil price would keep coming down. But a number of very large producers are dependent upon oil and gas revenues. And if at $10 per barrel, the social cohesion of these countries might not be sufficient. It might not work quite so well at $10 per barrel. And we've seen in the past that if social cohesion breaks down, quite often production can fall quite significantly in a very short period of time. So we'd expect the oil price to be much more volatile in that case, that you could be at $10 for a short period and then it will suddenly surge because of the shortfall in supply. So we wanted to avoid that kind of volatility. Generally speaking, volatility isn't helpful to anybody. And so we have this more smooth transition where everyone is working together, such that you don't have this opening up of new fields, and therefore you have the oil price at a higher level than it would be otherwise.
Thanks, Christophe. They're really, really important clarifications, and that's quite a strong and clear message. Basically, the more low-cost oil comes on, of course, the lower the price goes, and that will have, potentially quite stark implications for oil and gas dependent economies. On that note, Gleda Lan wanted to come in with a comment on oil and gas dependence, and I would also, I can see a number of country participants on the line who have taken part in our various training sessions and scenario analyses over the years. And of course, we have always in previous years used the sustainable development scenario as our most ambitious pathway. So for those of you country participants on the line who have done that detailed working through of scenarios and looking at risks and opportunities for your countries, please do come in and give us your reflections on, how the net zero pathway changes things for you, which risks and opportunities change. How would you recalibrate this, and what hard choices might it present? Theo, I can see you've got your hand raised. Have you got an immediate comment on this? If we come to you and then go to Gleda.
Yeah, it was just a quick add or footnote point to what Christophe just said, that in their modeling, they looked at it from a demand-led, and then of course anticipate what the supply side reaction to that then would be, and what the implications of that for the different countries really are. But the interesting thing for me really is that in a number of the countries that at least I know that I cover, most of the resources, that's the oil and gas resources, are sitting at a break-even cost of around between $25 and $40 a barrel. And sometimes some of those are even much higher. And it creates a lot of big problems for some of these economies. One, because we know that they have not diversified enough, and any kind of external shock or imposition would lead to some of those social cohesion issues that Christophe talks about. But I think the upside to this really is that there is an imperative maybe for a new development narrative or mandate in a lot of the countries that we're talking about, that maybe, and this is a big question, that the transition could even help, break the quote unquote resource curse in a number of these countries if you frame it not just about decarbonization, but importantly about economic growth and diversification and the jobs that come as a result out of that. And then one small point, and I'll shut up, is on the metal side of things, and I know we're not discussing this, Christophe showed a chart that shows you cobalt, copper, etc., increasing in production volumes and quantities. But I haven't seen any discussion, or at least modeling as yet, on the carbon intensity of those processes and how they also contribute one way or the other to greenhouse emissions. So it may look as though we're bashing oil and gas, but at the same time, there are these raw or rare minerals that we need that still needs to be extracted in a very energy intensive manner.
Thanks, Theo. Really important points there about, I think, putting forward the positive vision here. And I think we've all been quite open in the past that, the understanding and the narrative around climate-related and transition risks for the oil and gas sector is at the moment far stronger than what that alternative development pathway looks like, and what the domestic sustainable development argument for following a lower carbon greener pathway. On that note, I can see that we've got a clarification from Patrick and a few other participants. We'll come back to that. I just want to turn to McGlade quickly on dependency.
Yeah, thanks, Sian, and thanks, Christophe and Theo, because your points just tied in exactly with what I wanted to talk about. Christophe, it's a good thing that you mentioned volatility, because you always IEA lines and they're nice and smooth, and they suggest that maybe we can in accord nicely and smoothly, but that's not likely to be the case, as you suggest, and we could see a lot of volatility, a lot on the poorer countries. The countries are much less to cope with that kind of price volatility if their economies are already highly dependent on oil and gas, for example. And you see the richer countries planning for phase down. You see that in California. You've seen that in Denmark. Quite long timelines, but it's the idea of starting now and putting a date on it. There's time to plan for, like, the transfer of jobs, the kind of welfare that needs to be arranged around that, the subsidy, the fiscal policy reform, the commissioning costs and the liabilities. And at the moment you see a group of dependent exporters who are really struggling to attract investment for more exploration development, or squeezing more barrels. They're declining resources. You see it in Algeria, in Ecuador, in Vietnam, and some of those have turned to net imports in the last few years, because once oil and gas is produced domestically, it tends to be absorbed into the domestic economy, and fuel consumption, which is a good thing in terms of energy access, but often low prices, which are underpriced, and the necessary returns for government and encouraging efficient practices. So it's going to take a long time actually to get to that point. Diversification, which Theo mentioned, incredibly important here. So I'm in this issue of could we start thinking about timelines, but timelines that are right in the context of development needs. And I think that would hang in some of the financing that Christophe's talking about, really needed to kickstart other economy and deliver energy access.
Thanks, Glada. I mean, really helpful points about sort of thinking about that transition and the time frame for transition, and this, I think, will feed back into our discussion on finance and the kinds of policies and signals that producer countries need to be putting in place in order to access many of the opportunities that the net zero scenario presents. Before we move on to that discussion, I'm just going to quickly loop back. So that we've got a few outstanding questions and clarifications related to the oil and gas implications, and one in particular from Patrick Heller, our colleague, a clarifying request for IEA colleagues. Does your definition of new fields in development but not yet in production include, is your definition of new fields include fields in development but not yet in production, or just fields that haven't been discovered yet? And this is also something that we've discussed internally. What exactly is that definition? And also how, you mentioned in your opening comments about approved by the end of 2021. Is there a risk here of sort of prompting a rush of approvals?
Thanks, Shan, and thanks Patrick for the question. We've got quite a clear definition as to what this means. That a field goes through a planning stage first of all, where you've got to acquire permissions and permits. After you've gone through that planning stage, that project receives its final investment decision, and it then is, generally speaking, a couple of years before it starts producing. What we're saying is that if a field has received its FID by the end of 2021, then that is a production that would be in line with the net zero roadmap. One of the reasons that we have that is actually, if you look at our numbers, we have a slight increase in natural gas consumption over the next 5 years. We have this huge drop off in coal consumption, particularly in the power sector. And while there is a massive ramp up in renewables, in a number of places around the world where they have existing gas infrastructure, gas-fired power plants, to ensure that there is still a possibility to meet electricity demand, we have a slight increase in gas use in some areas. So you have an overall increase in gas demand. And so to meet that increase in gas demand globally, you require some of the projects that have received FID but aren't yet producing today. So some examples, I mean, Qatar, for example, has a large number of projects that have received FID, but aren't yet producing. On the kind of the incentivizing people rushing through, I mean, it's not that easy to rush a project through in 6 months. If you haven't started planning it yet, it's quite unlikely that you would be able to start from scratch and push it through. But again, I just really want to emphasize one very important point on this, and I'll stop speaking, that what the roadmap is trying to do is to highlight the risks that would be associated with new projects. It's trying to really make it very concrete about the milestones that exist along the road towards 2050 and what needs to happen by when to achieve that. If new projects are starting up, there is this additional risk that people might not have been aware of before, that there is the possibility that prices will be significantly lower and that there won't be demand for the production from these new projects.
Brilliant, thanks, Christophe. And I mean, moving on from that comment in terms of, obviously what we're looking at is one possible and credible pathway to net zero. There are many other ways that this could play out, as Glada mentioned, of course, the concept of a late and inevitable, far more disruptive transition. What are the policy tools? So Rahul Basu in the chat here has asked, what are the policy tools that are assumed? And I guess this also is a question of what are the indications that we can be looking for along the way from the major demand centers, the major importing economies, and as well in terms of the kinds of fiscal tools and the kinds of reforms that can help producer countries ensure that they are, beginning to reform their economies and are more attractive to investment in those clean sectors, those growth sectors. What assumptions does the net zero scenario make? And what do you see as a sort of key milestones? What are the short-term milestones that governments should be looking to?
Thanks, Shan. And I will start, and then Jasmine, please do feel free to jump in. The roadmap that we set up was a global roadmap. And so it did focus on some of the big high-level global milestones that exist. But of course, as with all of our modeling, we do this at a regional and country level, and then build it up from bottom up to get those global numbers. One of the things that people often talk about is carbon pricing. Carbon pricing on end-use sectors does play a role in the scenario. There is a carbon price, but we probably have less of a dependence on that than in many other scenarios. Many of these optimization scenarios that you see have very high carbon prices that start immediately and rise at a nice steady rate. We have a carbon price, but it's different across different countries because different countries have different policy preferences. So for example, we have a much lower carbon price in developing economies than in advanced economies. In advanced economies, it reaches around about $250 per ton in 2050. In developing economies, it's about 50, because we assume that there are other policies that we put in place, whether that is on renewable levels of renewables in the power sector, levels of biofuel blending, efficiency standards, for appliances, efficiency standards for buildings. All of these different policies will have a part to play. And different countries will pick and choose which ones suit their own domestic needs most. But essentially, all of these things in the net zero pathway need to happen very, very soon. The policy signals really need to begin tomorrow, so that we start getting this level of deployment that's required, both in terms of the technologies that we have available in the market today. Make sure we get that big scale up in solar, wind, in efficiency over the next 10 years. And then also, very crucially, governments have a big role to play in innovation. One of the things that we have coming through is on innovation, that governments will need to play a role in making sure that we have that level of innovation coming through. This is not going to happen by itself. We need this big scaling up in R&D, in these new technologies, to make sure that they're ready for the market come 2030. And this would be one area to look at. Look at the level of government support that exists for these new technologies. Right now, it's nowhere near the levels that it currently needs to be. It needs to kind of more or less triple to make sure that we have carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, and so on and so forth. Technologies that aren't available in the market, but will be needed.
So massive government support for R&D, and of course getting the prices and the regulation right. And there's an important and actually related question here from Neil Blackshaw on, is anyone attempting to value the society-wide benefits of the transition to net zero? So, to what extent does the modelling, well, the IEA, but also those of other mainstream scenario providers and others on the call may be better placed to respond to that. To what extent are we incorporating the public health, the biodiversity, the pollution, the governance impacts and co-benefits of a cleaner pathway? Christophe, I don't know if you want to come back on that, or if others, we have a wealth of experience amongst the participants on this call. So if others want to comment on that, please do come in. In the meantime, there's one specific question here for Theo from Victor Menotti, who asks about your short list of points advising countries who will not be low-cost producers to make exit easier, to make diversification less difficult, and what international support is needed. Greg, you've also equally made the point about the key challenge being enabling alternative economic pathways for new producers, supporting an accelerated economic diversification for existing producers, and how we begin to significantly upscale international cooperation, financial, technical, so on and so forth, for this purpose. Christophe, Jasmine, Theo, it would be great to turn back to you on these. Maybe we start with Theo quickly. And I also, would once again urge other participants and others on the call that, that there's just so much experience in the room here. So please do come in with your comments and responses on this and related questions. Theo, over to you.
Sorry, could you just quickly remind me, because I missed the last bit of the point.
I'm going to have to run back to the question. Bear with me 2 seconds. So Theo, your short list of points advising countries who will not be low-cost producers on how to make their exits easier, how to make their diversification less difficult. What international support is required?
Oh, right. Yeah, no, I think at the end of the day,
Small question.
Yes, big question. The bottom line now, it comes down to the dollars and the money and the investments that are required. I think in the IEA report, there was a number that they quoted that $5 trillion is required annually by 2030. That's $50 trillion of investment. To put it in comparative terms, Africa, which I know very well, the combined GDP is just $2.6 trillion. And the international commitment that have been made just at the G7 a few weeks ago is around $100 billion of investment every year. In the grand scale of things, it's just 2% of the annual investment requirement that is needed for the transition. But I think for countries, the question really comes down to what must they do, or what did they do in terms of the reforms to actually attract a share of these investments? Because my big worry or concern is that if we're not too careful, most of the investment may actually never end up going to the regions that need it the most, and actually then end up perpetuating some of the same old narratives that we actually have been fighting or advocating against. So I think on the international front, it behoves on both countries and the different institutions to actually drive and ensure that the monies do come in and they're actually going in to create those projects and jobs that ultimately are sustainable and in the long term. But countries have to do their bit. Sometimes we talk about international collaboration and it becomes a little bit amorphous in a way, because at the end of the day, we don't necessarily vote for international governments, but we vote for our respective governments. And it is those that we tend to hold sometimes even more accountable than these international organizations.
Thanks, Theo. Really, really good points there on the criticality of the 100 billion, right? And so we are hosting this week at Chatham House the annual climate change conference tomorrow and Friday. And registration is open and free to all as part of London Climate Action Week. And we'll be kicking off with a session on what defines success at COP26, and of course the delivery of the these pledges for 100 billion in climate finance is critical to mobilizing private sector finance and other sources of finance at the scale that Christophe and Jasmine have introduced. But it's also, of course, critical to trust and to continued cooperation and for clear messaging, clear signaling, and getting these financial flows into the spaces where they're needed. So it's a really, really important question, and I wonder, Greg, McGlade, others on the call, whether you want to come in quickly on this, on how producer countries can begin to think about positioning for climate finance and, of course, private sector finance in clean sectors, and the very specific challenges that oil and gas producers face in this. And I also note as well a comment in the bar here from Johnny West, asking surely part of this should be for the North to simply pay the Global South not to develop new fossil fuels based on the money they will lose out on. And of course, there is a very different and separate discussion about loss and damage, but that typically refers to unavoidable and unadaptable climate damages. And of course, the argument that we make here is that this pathway is eminently feasible with the right policy tools and with the right measures in place. McGlade, Greg, others on the call, does anyone want to come in on these points?
I think the report and the other one that Christophe mentioned both are very good at talking about how to transition the energy system, but for some certainly existing producers, but also in a different way for prospective producers. I think the question is bigger than energy, especially those who are either relying on oil exports or fossil fuel exports or intending to. The issue becomes a larger one, not just of energy, but of economic strategy as a whole. And where I see a particular challenge here, which is why I'm trying to think, are there alternative channels of international cooperation we can explore, is that I think one of the nasty paradoxes here is that the empirical evidence says to me that the more dependent an economy is on oil exports, the harder it is to reduce that dependence. And so it puts a lot of countries in an incredible bind.
Yeah, very, very good points there, Greg, and I think some really interesting comments coming out in the chat about the prospects for global coordination on this, on supply side restrictions effectively. And one comment from Rahul Basu saying basically without global coordination, each country is incentivized to extract. And it would a just transition would really require advanced economies and long-standing oil and gas producers to take the lead. On this note, I mean, Rahul, you've made a handful of comments here in the chat box. Would you like to come into the discussion and others on this issue of international cooperation and the prospects for a joined up sort of producer discussion about restrictions and who cuts, or do we think as a group and as participants that feels less than credible, and some of the risks that Christophe mentioned of lower cost supply coming online, plummeting prices, that they materialize?
I don't have a camera on, but hopefully you can hear me.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for this. Basically, I see us stuck in, what's called the Sins Green paradox. Every country will want to extract because politicians get money so that they can get re-elected. And eventually, you have to take into account there is some responsibility in terms of historic emissions, and there's an opportunity to gain revenue, as it's called. So, sort of countries who have already extracted a lot, like let's say Norway, for example, is still issuing licenses, whereas new producer countries get sort of knocked off because IEAs, limit as of the end of this year. And that would seem fundamentally unfair. And unless there's some way to coordinate this, we're eventually going to end up with everybody continuing to produce. I see this risk greater in coal, where the need for technology and investment is much lower. Like in India, a lot of our coal is fairly easy to extract, but there needs to be systematic thinking about this. And there is an element of unfairness that is particularly relevant to the new producers group.
Christophe, Jasmine, and Theo, do you want to come back on those sort of higher level comments about the prospects for international coordination, the risks associated with the net zero pathway as proposed? That would be great. Any immediate reflections on that?
Yeah, thanks, Sean, and thanks for all of the comments. They're really getting to the crux of where a lot of the issues are here. But I just want to highlight one thing within our scenario is that it's not as if we impose a supply side restriction. And as part of the scenario, as I mentioned before, that is a natural kind of output of the scenario from the demand side policies. It's not as if we say there is a kind of global coordinated effort to allocate who develops what field or who doesn't develop what field. It's just saying that if you have these demand side policies coming through, then you will have this very low oil price. And in a number of cases, a number of new fields, most new fields, I suspect, wouldn't be coming through at that low oil price. And if new fields are developed, the price will become even lower, and your risks get even larger. There's a kind of a difference between the market way of this working through and a global coordinated effort to say you can produce or you can't produce. But I fully agree that there is a need for properly understanding what the risks are here for emerging producers, and also trying to highlight where the opportunities exist. One thing we haven't really talked about a lot about yet is how these resources can be used in a way that is consistent with a net zero world. We, for example, have a big role for hydrogen in our net zero scenario, and blue hydrogen or hydrogen produced from natural gas is a part of that. In 2050, it's about 60% of the hydrogen that's produced is green or coming from renewables, and 40% is from natural gas. And that means that in 2050, half of global natural gas demand is for hydrogen and for low carbon hydrogen. So there's a big opportunity that exists there. There's also a big opportunity from the skills that exist for oil and gas extraction being possible to match it up with other low carbon technologies and creating new opportunities, new industries that can be consistent with those with clean energy technologies, to make sure that the resources don't become completely stranded, that everything has to stay under the ground. Another example is petrochemicals. There is a very, very large increase in recycling in our scenario, and this leads to means that the growth in petrochemicals isn't as large as it would be otherwise, but still a large amount of oil is required for petrochemicals. So making sure, for example, that the oil that is produced can be transformed into petrochemicals, making sure that that's done in a low cost and low emissions way is very important. And there are some opportunities there. So I don't think that this should be seen as a purely negative, all just massive risks and pure downside. There are opportunities here for creating new industrial capacities, given the resources that exist, that can be consistent. And as Theo has mentioned also, on critical minerals, for example, critical minerals is also a big opportunity here because the demand for them we see increasing very significantly going forwards.
I can add just a small point to
Go ahead, Theo.
What Christophe said, but I think Rahul makes a very valid point and observation about the element of unfairness, especially in the context of historic emissions. And for a number of countries, or at least for some of the policy makers that I engage or speak to, it's like we are being punished unnecessarily for something which we only contribute less than 1% of it, you know, in terms of the total emissions. And this is specifically in the context of sub-Saharan Africa. And these supply side restrictions, although they are market imposed or maybe market imposed, also would be influenced by some of these international collaborations and engagements going forward. But I think for a lot of the countries, they probably might end up going or trying to do things on their own. And that whereas international collaboration may be important and may be needed, I am guided by history in the sense that most of these collaborations and most of this big talk often ends up being more rhetoric than reality. And what then happens is that every country or region tends to go, you know, on their own. But the jury really is, you know, out there on that. But I certainly think that in terms of what needs to be done going forward, perhaps the developed economies need to shoulder a bit more of the responsibility, taking into account the historical emissions.
Thanks, Theo and Christophe. These are really, really good points. And actually, there's something that we explored with UCL, Christophe, building on your work back in 2015 on a geographical distribution of unburnable carbon, where we looked at the implications if you were to allow more headspace effectively for low income, least developed countries to produce. And our findings there were really that there weren't net development benefits, because the time that it took to deliver development benefits from oil and gas production was so long. And there was, in any case, you know, this question of countries competing for a much smaller, much reduced share of the pie under a 1.75 degree scenario that was. So the implications of that really were that the most equitable pathway to stranding assets and managing unburnable carbon was the least cost one, and to really ramp up that international support and international transfers of technology and of finance, of course, to ensure that developing country producers have a different pathway. So the link to that article is in the chat box, and of course this is, you know, a huge topic ahead of COP26, and one that will just become increasingly prominent around a just transition and how to manage an equitable and orderly decline. We have a couple of minutes left, and I am trying to see if we've missed any comments or questions. There are many in the chat box. I also, Christophe, you decided to drop the word hydrogen with 6 minutes to go, which may have been strategic. I wanted to ask, I mean, two quick questions on the issue, the issues that we've just picked up on there that we haven't really gone into and that we probably don't have time to go into now, but just quick comments and reflections. First on hydrogen and particularly this question about the potential to repurpose oil and gas infrastructure, or whether we're actually talking about new infrastructure, new, different supply and demand centers. Because in my experience, particularly in financing discussions, there's this tendency to say that, oil and gas infrastructure can be Paris aligned because it can be converted to hydrogen, and very, very little understanding of, the actual specifications and the costs and the likelihood, how credible the market for that might be. So any quick comments on that would be great. And then also separately on this question of critical metals and minerals, I wonder, are there any sort of clear winners and losers that emerge from your work? And the reason I ask this is because this is often sort of held out as a panacea. There's this other opportunity. But it's not really like for like, because we're talking about a capital input, not an operating input. It's not a fuel that you have to keep supplying and burning. And we're also talking about a global mining market where, you know, investment has typically been concentrated in, you know, safe haven OECD jurisdictions, and emerging producers have really struggled to get greenfield developments off the ground. So yeah, any sort of indications of who are the winners and losers, and, you know, what the potential upside here might be, would be great, Christophe. And you have 2 minutes for that.
Thanks. This might be a little bit of a challenge.
No, you can go over a little bit.
On hydrogen, again, one of the key things we want from this scenario is to set out the roadmap, or how we get to the endpoint. And for hydrogen, we do have a role over the next 10 years. It is quite uncertain where hydrogen is going to be best suited, what production route it's going to come from, who's going to produce it, how far it's going to be transported. But over the next 10 years, there is an opportunity to convert some existing uses of high carbon hydrogen to low carbon hydrogen. That seems to be a good way to start to prove up some of the technologies that are required to see whether this is going to work or not. So the refining industry is a big user of high carbon hydrogen today. The industry sector is also. So if we can convert those existing uses to low carbon hydrogen, if we can start to inject hydrogen into existing natural gas pipelines, just at small volumes to start off with, to see if everyone is happy with that, it will start to help to scale up production facilities, whether that's electrolyzers, whether it's natural gas with carbon capture and storage. And then we also need to start to prove up the other demand side end use technologies, whether this is ammonia in ships, whether it's other industrial facilities converting to using hydrogen-based steel, for example, all of these new technologies which require innovation efforts. All those things need to happen in parallel, and then it will become more apparent as we go down the line which of these is going to be a success and which is not going to be a success. We don't really fully know today. We've made some assumptions as to how costs will change and how technologies will change, but we know from the past that things can happen much quicker and much more slowly than is assumed in models. But we shouldn't kind of rule anything out at this stage. We should see what can be done and what is going to work. There's much more I could say on that, but I'll stop. And on critical minerals, one thing, very important point that Jasmine mentioned in her presentation is that the supply currently of critical minerals is much more geographically concentrated than is the case for oil. There are certain countries which are very large producers of certain critical minerals, but it's also the case that the processing for a lot of these is also very geographically concentrated. And that's potentially where there is some opportunity here, because it's not always the case, and actually it's not often the case, that the processing facilities are located close to where they are mined. They're quite often mined, transported, processed, and then transported elsewhere again. And so there's an opportunity there for countries which are resource rich in a lot of these to kind of capture an even greater share of the rents and opportunities that exist there by potentially making sure that more of those facilities are located close to home. But I will put in the chat a link to our report on critical minerals, because it discusses in much more detail where the specific countries are and where the specific industries are, which could potentially do well or not so well.
Brilliant, thanks, Christophe. So yeah, opportunities there, but yeah, geographically concentrated at the moment. It also speaks to, you know, this long-standing country priority of, you know, moving up the value chain and getting beyond raw material extraction. But I think the potential for developing countries to participate in those supply chains and develop decarbonized sustainable metals and mineral supplies is a really, really important question. So yeah, thank you for posting the link, and one to be picked up in future. Jasmine and Theo, any final quick remarks, and then we will wrap it up there.
Just to add on to what Christophe mentioned about critical minerals, as he mentioned, it's much more geographically concentrated, it could be seen as a plus. But then at the same time, for oil and gas producers, the rise in critical minerals offers them a new opportunity in order to maintain their skills and make sure that their skills don't go to waste. So as we see, mining is something that will be much needed, and that's something that they should start focusing on and thinking on, and it's something that might be beneficial in the long run. Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, with what we've been discussing, it comes back to perhaps the point we've made and Greg also made about a new development strategy, new thinking, new paradigms, and the producer countries now needing or requiring to think through this a bit more strategically and think of how they can take advantage of the transition to, create jobs and to create, sustainable economies.
Brilliant. So that's, I think, a perfect note to end on. Christophe, Jasmine, thank you so much for your presentation and for your comments today. It's been a really, really fascinating discussion. And Theo, thank you for joining us and offering your reflections and comments. And thank you, all of you in the audience, for joining us today and being so open and engaged and having so many questions. And I apologize if we didn't get through all of them. Please take a note of all of the resources in the chat box. Please keep in touch with us and with one another, and check out all of the recordings of this session and of the other great webinars that the New Producers Group has held recently on the New Producers Group website. So with that, thanks all and enjoy the rest of your days.